What I'm going to do today is walk you guys through my finish process on all my tooled projects. And we're going to be covering everything: oil, dye, paint, lacquer, finish, antiques, all that good stuff. I'm going to show you the products I use as well as the order I use them in, including dry times. Done here is I have a lot of these tooled samples, and what they are is it's just a part of a belt pattern out of my pattern book that I offer. But I took this same piece and I tooled it up. We got a ton of them tooled so I can show you every process after the dry time. But the three finishes that we're going to be looking at are right here. We have what I call a natural antique finish, and then we have one with dyed borders and dyed backgrounds. And then over here we have the dyed borders with painted backgrounds to give that extra depth look of a filigree look with paint rather than actually cutting out of your leather. So to achieve all three of these looks, our first step is going to be the same. We're going to take, this is a raw piece, this is veg tan, Herman Oak veg tan strap leather that has been tooled, and it's dried up now after it's been tooled. The first product, which there's going to be a link in the description to all these products, so anything you want, jump on there and get a hold of these products. But this first product is pure neat's foot oil. And what I'm going to apply that with, if you're a saddle maker and happen to have some sheepskin handy, some scraps, that works great. Otherwise, there's dressing fleece, and this is actually just a chunk of that cut. When they come, they're going to be in a large pack, so that's you can get a few applications out of each piece of that. But we're going to get a little bit of oil on here. Just nice even coverage. Okay, super simple step. And again, every one of these finishes, the first step is going to be that oil right there. So you can see it's going to take a while. That's going to dry in there. How much time do I let that dry? A good rule of thumb, all my drying time is going to be let it dry an hour. And now if you went super heavy on your oil, it would require more dry time. But for the amount I oil, a nice light covering like that, an hour is going to be fine. If I'm going to do painted backgrounds on one, that's going to be the next thing I do. So after that oil has dried for an hour, now there's a piece that's been oiled and dried. Now it's going to be time to start running our paint. Right here, we're going to use a nice turquoise color to match up with what we did here, but an Angelus brand acrylic paint. I love this paint. It gets good even coverage, but make sure you get a good shake on that. Every time I use that, I shake that good. One of the biggest questions I get is, do I thin that out? I typically do not. Most times I run right out of the jar here. If it does get to being a little bit thick and heavy in there, then I will go ahead and use this too thin. So, I mean, I have had this little jar of too thin for quite some time. A little goes a long ways. But you'll see I'm going to transfer some of this paint right into this dish here. So we just start a fresh pile right there. I just dip a little bit in there. And again, if I'm feeling like it's starting to get too thick, then I'll get some of that too thin, and with a little dropper here, I'll put in like just a drop or two into that amount of paint and mix that up, and it works fine. But most times I just run straight out of there and it works amazing. I'm not worried about going super thick. Some colors are going to require a little bit more of a coat. Make sure I'm not casting too much of a shadow there on you, but I'm going to get right down in there. But I just want a nice even coverage here. And I'm already planning that I'm going to have to come back and give this a second coat. Okay, because I don't want any transparent spots in there. And you can see, hopefully you can see when I first do that, kind of there in the middle, it looks a little sparse, and you can kind of still see your leather color through there. That's okay right now. Okay, the main thing is we just get one coat on there. Think of it like if you're priming your walls in your house or anything that you're painting where you're going to use that primer on there. This first coat of paint is almost just soaking in there some and getting everything primed, ready to go, putting that base layer down. And there's a couple ways you can do. You can either go all the way through a project and then come back and repaint it all, or a lot of times what I'll do is I'll work through a project like this. I'll go down a few, 3 or 4 background spaces, then I'll come back to my first one and it's dry enough to put that next coat over. Now, one big question I get is, well, do you ever have any trouble with that paint sticking, especially with oil? No, I have no problem with it at all. I oil everything I do, and that's as long as you let that oil dry, it's going to soak in there, and with the oil, you're moisturizing your leather. I mean, you're kind of just conditioning that leather. You're going to get a little bit of color out of your oil, get some of that richer color difference in there, but a lot of that's conditioning that, and it's evening out your moisture content so that your leather's going to take the dye a lot more even, and it still has more to soak in, so it's gonna take in all your paint, all your dye just fine. Okay, first coat on all those spaces. I get right down in along my lines, and you'll notice I didn't run any background tools in these backgrounds. When I do a painted background, it's, again, to help give that illusion of a filigreed look to it, but I want to add as much depth as I can. So with these background spaces still being beveled on the sides, you can kind of see almost the light shine off of those with that depth in there. It's almost like having plugged backgrounds in there. I'm going to go back, touch up here, give one more light coat over top, and this is going to be sure that we have a good solid coverage on there. I'm going to set this aside right here, and we'll come back to that one in just a second. I'm going to move over to another piece that, again, this has had our coat of oil on it. It's sat and dried. But now, instead of doing the painted backgrounds, we're going to go ahead and do dyed backgrounds on this one. So the dye that I'm going to be using today is the Phoebe's leather dye, and this is a cordovan, is the color that I'm using. A big question and debate is between the leather dye and the pro dye. I like them both great. The pro dye works amazing as well. It happens to be that cordovan comes in the leather dye, and I really like that color. I have that poured into just a smaller clear plastic jar here, but this is a wide mouth one that makes it easy for me to get into with my brush. And we're going to go ahead and get these backgrounds dyed. So one important thing when I dye that, I'm going to dab that brush off on the side, so I'm not packing a whole lot of dye in that brush. Dab that off so it doesn't run too far. Where our paint, we have to actually paint that on. Your dye, if you've never dyed backgrounds before or messed with this dye, you can see that that'll run a little bit. When I put that brush down, it'll actually run there. Just imagine just be like dropping a drop of water on there, right? So we're going to use that to your advantage and let that run down in the cracks where you need it to be. But if you get too much dye on your brush, you can run into troubles there and have that run in places you don't want it to. And again, this piece has already been oiled, so that oiling is going to help help your leather take the dye more evenly, especially if you're doing smooth surfaces. You'll see out here the smooth surface at the end of this and around our borders. That can be kind of tricky to get even dye color on, but with the moisture being even in that leather due to being oiled, it's going to take that dye a whole lot more even. All right, getting down to this last background spot here. Touch up, make sure I get good even coverage on all that. Okay, so there's our dyed background versus our painted background. Again, I'm doing this all the way in order of how I would do this for all these pieces to get to our finished product. Next is going to be if we want a dyed border on here. So both of these are going to get a dyed border. I'm just going to show you on one because I have others prepped and ready to go. But if I'm dyeing a border, we'll go back and dye this one. Again, using that to your advantage where it will run in there. I'm going to go right around the edge of my tooling here and give myself just a little bit of room out here. I'm not going to use this little brush to go all the way out to the edge, and I'll show you why here in just a second. I have another tool I like to use that is going to be a big time saver in all your projects here. Again, there is a link in the description to all of these products that we're using. There's also a link to my website, 23plus.com, if you want any more information about other classes that I offer or different pattern packs, pattern books, and that sort of thing. So be sure to check that out if that's anything that you're interested in, and take advantage of getting these good products here. And one thing that helps your dyeing too, when everything kind of builds on itself, right? So we talk about that in tooling, good running your swivel knife good, makes it easier to bevel, all that sort of thing. But the one thing too when it comes to this dye work is if you have a good crisp bevel line out there, that's going to help your dye fit down in there. Now, I still need to get around that border more, right? Okay, here's what I'm going to switch to. And this is just a 1-inch foam brush. And these work amazing. They hold a ton of dye, so be sure when you use that, dab that off. Do not let that down with the whole thing full of dye, or you will create a huge mess and a headache for yourself. So dab that off a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come around and go and dye this edge all the way. Okay, coming around here now, I can come right up, just kind of overlap where I dyed to with that brush. And I'm laying down good even coverage all the way around here. Now, again, to keep up with our steps here, we started with a coat of oil on there, a coat of neat's foot oil, and then we came back with our paint and our dye. Now, if I wanted to dye my borders first and then paint my backgrounds, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Either way, those two steps are coming after my oil, before any of my other finishes. Exchange these out. We'll add one there that has been dried. It says the dyed border, dyed background on that. Okay, this painted one, I'm going to replace that with one that has had the dry time. So once I do my paint and my dye, I let that sit dry for an hour. Okay, this one's an exception because I just want to show you one with the dyed backgrounds and the natural border there too. We have those. Now, I'm also going to pull in my other natural antique piece that we're going to do. And this one has had its coat of oil and dried as well. The next step we're going to do is going to be, we need to put a lacquer on this. We need to seal all of that down, seal our dye, seal our paint, and even seal all the smooth leather on our natural piece as well. So this next product I'm going to use, I'm going to give it a good shake here, but this is RTC Sheridan Resistant Finish from Be Natural Leather Care. Again, link to that in the description as well. But we're going to get some on our fleece there. Just a nice, good, even coverage there. Okay. Now, same thing when we get to our dyed borders, dyed backgrounds, even the dyed backgrounds and natural borders. Now this we just dyed not very long ago, but I'm going to show you we can even get by right over top there. Okay. Now we have this one. Again, same thing. RTC. Be Natural. Right over top here. Okay. Now what you're going to see that color start coming up onto my fleece there? Don't panic. That's not the end of the world. What's happening, if you're doing a big project, you got to be careful you don't get a ton of that on there and then wipe that onto natural leather. It could transfer a little bit. But when we put that dye on there, there's kind of that extra pigment that stays sitting at the top of that. And you can see kind of the variance in color. It looks like almost it'll go to a dull bit there. If you've used straight black dye, you'll really notice it in the straight black dye. But there's almost a little bit of a greenish sheen and tint to that. You can kind of see around those edges. Well, what that is the extra pigment in that dye, especially these darker, deeper colors are going to have that. A lighter, a light brown or golden brown aren't going to have that sit on there quite as bad. But if we pull a little bit of that extra off, that's not a big thing because we still have the dye in the leather and there's still the good even dye coverage on there. So we're not taking the dye out of there, we're just taking the extra dye that's on top. But paint, here is where it gets tricky. When you're going to lacquer over top of your paint, we have got to be careful. Okay, I'm going to get a little more on there. If I just went and wiped across that paint like I've done on those other pieces, I'd smear my paint and wipe it off of there. So we don't want to do that. We've got to be careful and dab over that paint because that's still an acrylic paint that has no covering on it right now. There's nothing sealing that paint. So we need to seal that paint, but we have to be careful. So I'm going to dab straight down. And you can see that doesn't remove any paint. I make sure I have plenty of RTC on my fleece there. So it's getting still the good even coverage, but you have to dab that instead of wiping it. Such an important part of that. If you wipe that, I promise you will smear that off. So be careful on that. All right, we're going to set those aside. Those need to sit and dry. We're going to let that dry for at least an hour. Okay, now our three pieces have dried for an hour. We've done our oil first, then we went to our dye and our paint work, then we came back with RTC and put a seal on there. Now, the next step in that is going to be to antique. So when I antique, the antique we're going to use is right here. It's a Phoebe's Mahogany Antique Finish. Now make sure when you get this that you get the regular antique finish, not the gel antique. There is a difference in the products, so the link in the description on here will take you to this antique finish. It's the paste rather than the gel. Okay, and this paste works well for the process we're doing. The gel, not so much for this. The gel will eat through your finish, but it works great for a whole nother look if you're after that. The next thing I'm going to do is just grab a little surgical glove here, a little latex glove, because the leather on your hand will dye in antique just as well as the leather that you're tooled up. So I have that there. Another thing you're going to need is a rag of some sort around. Honestly, what works really well, first our applicator is going to be the same fleece again. What works really well to take this off at the end is honestly old socks. I turn the sock inside out. I'd wash them first. I wouldn't just take them off, but good clean old used socks. Turn that inside out. The fibers on there are just enough. They really take our antique out where we want it to be taken out of. But let's start. We're going to start over here again with our natural piece. I'm going to take that fleece, get some antique on there. Now, this is the first time you've seen this done. You'll think you ruin your project when you go smearing this stuff on here. But it is by far from ruined. It's probably one of the coolest things for tooling, I think, because it really accentuates and brings out all the detail, all the little fine cuts and shading and the things we work so hard for when you're tooling. They're going to come out and really pop when you put that on there. So I'm kind of working in little circles there, make sure I'm getting down in all my decorative cuts and all those shading areas, and then I come back and I'm going to wipe that right straight off. Okay, the purpose of this antique is to get down in all the little cuts and the little detail areas, but to make those pop, it needs to come off of the smooth leather. So that's why we use the RTC as a resist. Now what the RTC does is it resists the antique. So as long as I come and get that off right away, it's not going to bleed through and discolor my actual leather. We just want that antique to sit down in all those cracks and cuts. Okay, I'm going to set that one aside. We'll come back to our dyed borders, dyed backgrounds piece. Follow the same routine. I'm going to get my antique on there. We're going to smear that in. Again, get down in all your cuts, all your cracks, get in by that flower center. We're going to come wipe that off. Kind of get down there in those background spots. And get that antique out of there as well, so it's not gummed up. There we go. Look at how that makes that pop. All the little details pop in that. Okay, now we're down to our painted background piece. Now this has our resist on there. It has the RTC, remember. So that paint has a layer of protection. So I can wipe this on here, but I'm going to not sit there and really scrub on it. I mean, that RTC works great, but we're not going to push this any further than we have to, right? Because we still have some more finish work that's going to go on this to help seal that paint in and give it its longevity. We're not quite there yet, so don't get too aggressive here. But it is protected more now, so we can go ahead and get that antique in there. I've never had any problem when I'm rubbing antique into my piece, take any paint off. Sometimes if I get too aggressive when I wipe that off, I may take just a touch of it off. So I kind of be careful not to wipe real hard across where those painted backgrounds are. I mean, I'll still wipe across, but I'm not gonna really scrub on them. Now, if you do happen to take some of your paint off, it's not the end of the world. We can always go touch back up with that acrylic over top of your RTC is completely fine, and that will hold up and last as well. Okay, right there, being easy. We still have not taken any of that off. Looks fantastic. Next thing, here's where our dry time switches a little bit. Notice I'm not making sure no sleight of hands here. I'm keeping all these in view. I'm not switching these out on you. We just got done antiquing these. Okay. The next thing I'm going to go for is Phoebe's Resin. Just the neutral color Resin. Again, give that a good shake. I have another scrap of my fleece there. The other thing I'm going to use is a piece of this towel. This is just a blue paper towel. Works really good for this step as well. So we'll get the cap off of that. We'll go back in order. We'll start with the natural one. Move right on through here. Okay, I'm going to get some of this on my fleece. Run that all over top of that. You see the kind of that milky look to it? Now I'm going to wipe right across there. And you can see we took just a little bit of that antique off, right? So we've already wiped antique off with that rag, but now we're getting just a little extra off of our smooth leather. So people, if you ever have a problem with some of your antique rubbing off, it's probably because you had excess on there and didn't go to a step like this with the Resin to take that excess off of your smooth leather. The other thing that's going to do is it's going to get in and almost reliquify some of your extra antique and drop that further down in those cuts and in around your edge. And then when that sets in there, you have a really nice, solid set, antique look to that. Okay, come along here to our next piece. Still have plenty on here. Run that across. Wipe right across here. Again, you'll see some of that dye and antique come off there, and that's just coming off our surface. Still keep a really nice, even coverage on all of your dye work. We didn't blotch anything up by doing that. Now for our painted one, same thing. Now this is going to be that final sealing step. It's going to really get your longevity out of this. Run that across there. Wipe over there. Now again, same thing with this step. I'm not being super aggressive over top of those paint spots. I wanted to go ahead and leave some of this Resin right over top of that paint. I'll take just enough off, but I didn't wipe super hard and take any of that paint off with it. And now it has super awesome, flexible, durable coat of that Resin to help seal that in. Then once that dries, you come to your final products. Okay, we have final pieces, all dried up, lacquered, antiqued, ready to go. Now this is not the only way to finish, the only way to use these products. It may not even be the right way if you read on some of the jars, but it's what's worked for me and what I've kind of learned through trial and error over the years, and adjusted, found these different products and put those together, and it seems to work and is getting really good results for me. So I encourage you guys to try this. If some of this, if even a piece of this works for you, I hope that you find value in it.